Hello. Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this last day of the COP. It's been a marathon 2 weeks, and I know we all energy levels are almost at zero, but we hope for this last event this last events at this COP, we'll have the energy to take this through. So my name is Dure Hallison, Policy and Partnership Manager for WWF Africa, and also manage our partnership with the African Development Bank based in Abidjan. And I will be moderating this session. So as you all know, Africa in the last decade before the outbreak of COVID-19 has experienced unprecedented growth across a range of development indices. We saw in Africa from countries like Ethiopia, we had the fastest growing economies in Africa. Much of this growth, however, is related to the natural capital with which the continent is richly endowed. We have fertile agricultural land, minerals, healthy fish stocks, and forest resources that supply both local and export markets. The continent's iconic wildlife, coral reefs, and other ecosystems also sustain a thriving tourism sector. You can ask that to countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and others in East Africa especially. This growth in most cases has happened at the expense of Africa's biodiversity and ecosystems, jeopardizing the livelihoods of millions of people depending on the goods and services provided by nature, and this definitely could have broader consequences for achieving the SDGs. However, as Africa shifts gear, there are opportunities to ensure that its ecological and natural resource base, the foundation of its growth, is not irrevocably damaged and can continue to support long-term sustainable development. To make the right choices, it is critical that policy makers understand the links between drivers such as population growth, socioeconomic development, climate change, energy, food, and water needs. The Africa Ecological Features was conceived by WWF and African Development Bank as a thought leadership that is way back in 2012, with the aim of designing development pathways that will lead Africa towards a long-term sustainable future in line with the SDGs, but also in line with the African Agenda 2063 on the Africa we want, but also on other international environmental commitments necessary for its own prosperity. In 2015, WWF and the African Development Bank launched the landmark report, the Africa Ecological Features, which examined the conflicts of factors that positively sustained a steady economic growth in Africa over the past 10 to 15 years, but may either solidify the economic gains and enhance sustainability or compromise the potential for future growth depending on the economic decisions that African countries make today. It therefore seeks to engage key decision makers across Africa in processes that will identify and interrogate Africa's ecological and environmental features by investigating environmental pressures and identifying emerging scenarios and enhance dialogue about shaping a balanced future for the continent. This initiative represents a data and science-driven assessment, advocacy, solutions development initiative that aims to build an understanding of these development trends and opportunities that affect the sustainability of Africa's growth path. When this initiative began, like I said earlier, in 2012, with the launch of the report in 2015, we just had two partners, the African Development Bank and WWF. But today, as you can all witness with this site event, we have seen the expansion of this initiative with new partners, especially as we start to unpack the whole scenario of ecological features and now looking at sector-based or thematic-based areas like food. So for this particular site event today, we have been privileged to be partnered with several partners, which include, like I said earlier, the African Development Bank is still part of it, the WWF is still part of it, but we have new partners like the International Environment, sorry if I got it wrong, Institute of IIED, Institute for International Environment and Development, right? Sorry if I missed these things up. We have CGI, we have the International Food Policy Research Institute, we have SEAT Biodiversity, and we have received guidance from the World Bank, among other stakeholders. The site event, which we're having today, on reimagining food policies and investments towards a climate resilient and nature positive future, is building on the work that began with the bank, now with a deep dive on the food systems with more partners, like I said earlier, than in 2015. Our site event here today will be divided into two parts. We'll have the first part, which will be the presentation of the findings and the recommendations of the African Ecological Food Features analysis, and then we'll have a panel discussion to start to unpack some of the recommendations and findings. So without much ado, I would like now to call the first speakers, and we'll start with Ms. Nancy Rapando. Ms. Nancy Rapando is WWF African Food Feature Leader. She is a sustainable agricultural specialist with broad experience in Africa in program management, policy analysis, and technical advisory work. She has worked with diverse actors across East, Central, and Southern Africa on agricultural value chains, natural resource management, climate change and food and nutrition security. Nancy holds a master's in agronomy from the prestigious Egerton University in Kenya, and she's now pursuing a PhD in climate change and adaptation from the Institute of Climate Change and Adaptation at the University of Nairobi. Welcome, Ms. Nancy. Our second speaker will be Dr. Carlo Fada. Carlo is also leading the global initiative. Carlo is also leading the global initiative called Nature Positive Solutions, which is part of the CGIAR. This is a transdisciplinary project that promotes sustainable agriculture and nature positive solutions in 5 countries, of which 2 are in Africa, Kenya and Burkina Faso, but then you have India, Vietnam, and Colombia. It aims at ensuring food and nutrition security, improve livelihoods within planetary boundaries by promoting biodiversity. Welcome, Father Carlo. Sorry. You can go by first name. Thank you very much. So I think with these first 2, we will have the presentation of the report, and then we'll go into the deep dive into the panel discussions, where we'll bring in the rest of the panelists. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Okay, thanks, Durell. Thank you. So I'll start by making the presentation. Just to say that this report is on the analysis of the implications of Africa food system development on environmental sustainability, and it is one of the sectoral series of the Africa Ecological Futures that Durell has just talked about. And just as a background, we give an analysis of the interconnectivity between food systems and ecosystems. Major drivers being climate change, land suitability, water availability, and biodiversity. These are major environmental drivers. We know very well that continuously farming communities are looking for suitable land, and they're also looking at how to have enough water for production. But we also have the socioeconomic drivers, which include demography. The increasing population in Africa continues to threaten the environment, because more people implies more land required for production. Urbanization, another major driver. The more urbanization implies a change in the food system, but it also could imply more food loss and waste, and all this actually ends up within our environment. Issues around technology, governance, markets and trade, culture and behavior are critical food system drivers, but all this imply that the impacts are all at global level, global food systems. The impacts are at regional level and also at national level, because we are seeing changes both in consumption, production, processing, and distribution, and all these are actually impacting on the Africa ecosystems. So the typology, we did a typology of food systems in Africa compared to the world. And if you look at the map for Africa, it actually shows that compared to industrialized countries like the US and part of Brazil, that are all industrialized and consolidated, most of the Africa, actually, we are looking at rural and traditional food systems. Some of them are just informal and expanding, and a few of them are actually under emerging and diversifying, probably towards the north of Africa. But this, when you look at Africa, the type of food system that we see implies that practices that include shifting cultivation and a small-scale farming are major ones that are actually threatening the ecosystem. But also it was clear from the analysis that export trade will continue to grow, but the major impact on our ecosystem will actually be small-scale agriculture. So when you look at domestic versus export markets, domestic food production is actually a major driver of cropland expansion. So looking at the graphs that we have, the green graph actually implies domestic market 2000 and 2013. The light blue is actually showing from 1986 to 2000, that is domestic markets. But the yellow and the orange, which are nearly the same color, are all showing expansion out of export markets. So it is very clear that most expansion is actually out of domestic food markets. And so if this is not checked, and with drivers that have named like increasing population, it implies that the impacts on the Africa ecological systems will actually be become problematic in the future. We also have evidence on population growth and dynamics as a key driver, looking at population growth and increasing urbanization. We see that urban diets in Africa are becoming unhealthier, while food waste and losses indirectly contribute to cropland expansion. So this map actually shows the concentration of the populations in Africa, but it actually, if you look at the areas very well, there are major areas of suitable land for production. So that means that most of the population is actually going towards areas that are suitable, have suitable land, and as this actually happens, it implies that they're going to have major impacts on the ecological systems. Population growth and dynamics as a key driver. What we see is that urban population and cropland expansion are becoming really key drivers in these areas. And as human settlement increases, that means there is more pressure to gain more land. When you look at the areas in red, actually show the areas of human settlement, and the areas of green show areas of cropland expansion. And we actually use the map of the Greater Virunga landscape, and it actually shows in green that there is more cropland expansion in the Greater Virunga area, especially where we are supposed to be having conservation efforts happening. When you look at agriculture expansion as a factor in deforestation, what we have in red being cropland and being forest loss, and what we see in green being actually cropland, it actually shows you that cropland expansion is actually getting into forested ecosystems. So we use the Kaza landscape, the transfrontier landscape, to show this, because for us as WWF, our areas of concern are actually the conservation areas. And what we see is that there is more degradation within the protected areas. For example, when you look at this area, these are the protected areas, but just around it, you see a lot of expansion that is getting towards the protected areas. So if these areas are not well protected with clear governance systems, then we might risk losing some of these areas. We also looked at an analysis in terms of food systems as a factor in deforestation. and looking at deforestation overall versus deforestation in protected areas. But what really are the major drivers? When you look at the America system, the major driver is actually pasture and some way of limited shifting cultivation. But looking at the yellow band in Africa and the orange band, it's all shifting cultivation and other subsistence agriculture, which is all by small-scale farmers. So what this implies is that in Africa, agriculture is the major actually driver of deforestation. There is limited pasture development in these areas. The trend is actually nearly the same when you look at the protected areas. So it actually implies that whether outside protected areas towards protected areas, we are seeing the same trend of more subsistence farming actually threatening the ecosystems. This map actually shows crop expansion around key biodiversity areas, the same trend as we do a deep dive into what we call the Kaza landscape again. And outside the formal protected areas, we are seeing a lot of crop expansion. So when you look at the areas that are drawn in blue, these are the protected areas with very strict governance rules. But look at what is happening around them. A lot of production around these areas. So it actually just emphasizes what we've been talking about. This map actually shows the type of agriculture expansion as a factor of deforestation. When you look at Central Africa, especially DRC and Central Africa Republic, we are seeing smallholder farming that is shown by a spoon and a fork being the common one. Across Africa, smallholder farming becomes a very common driver of deforestation. So this map actually just brings out the emphasis that in most African landscapes, smallholder farming is a major driver of deforestation. Central Africa, Cameroon, we are seeing most of it. We are seeing some large-scale farming actually in Central Africa. This could be the commodities in these areas. But let's not also forget issues around wood fuel that are a big driver. But why are you getting wood fuel? It's actually about cooking food. So that means that food systems continue driving deforestation from different sides. So we beyond this report, we want now to go into a decision space, looking at what scenarios are plausible for Africa to take if we have to go towards an ecological future for Africa. And so we are looking at 3 scenarios for now, but we want to actually catalyze discussion across stakeholders starting from this meeting to actually come up with more potential scenarios that we can actually develop a plausible future around. But we've chosen the first 3. One of them is changing food production. We need more policies to secure land rights, investments in appropriate green technology and infrastructure, and redirecting our subsidies towards locally led innovations and adaptations so that we are actually generating solutions that are actually locally adaptable. So the next one would be planning where to grow. And this looks at applying appropriate land use planning systems and also bringing back degraded lands into production. So we are looking at that as also a scenario that Africa could actually look at as a pathway. The third one is on influencing food demand and consumption. How do we bring about dietary changes and also reduce on import foods? And then how do we also have more commitments in Africa on reducing food waste and loss and also looking at circular economy? I'm just coming to the end, looking at the key recommendations. These are actually quite abstract because if we do the scenarios, then we will come up with more solid recommendations. But one of them is we need to develop and implement coherent policies, especially how does agriculture and environment and health really work together in coherence? How do we invest in increasing agricultural productivity in a sustainable way, supporting poor farmers to transition to sustainable agriculture and non-agricultural livelihoods? and investing in socially responsible value chain development. So looking at this is actually how do we support African communities to actually transition towards sustainability. So many issues that come in, probably these transitions will be expensive. Do we need any incentives for this? So those are critical things that we really need to start discussing from this meeting. So at the end of the day, we actually ask critical questions that do you feel that Africa's need and ambition to become sufficient in food supply is compatible with its ecological future. And we also, from this meeting, we will be requesting for additional recommendations on what needs to be done to put Africa towards an ecological pathway. So I believe these two questions can be easily discussed during the plenary sessions. So at the end of the day, today serves as a soft launch for this report. So kindly feel free to scan the QR code and you will have the report within your systems. Thank you so much. Durell, I'm done with my time.
Thanks so much, Nancy, for such a brilliant presentation of that report. And as you see, one of the things that we're trying to do with this report is to bring together some of the key aspects related to Africa's development path. Food, environment protection, and when we're talking about environmental protection, we're looking at nature, we're looking at climate, but we're also looking at health. So I think it will be important for you, it will be interesting to read this report and then try to help go ahead with, or try to provide us some recommendations to push this thing ahead. So at this point, I'll call on Dr. Carlo Fada, and you will have 5 minutes. And
thank you. And please, no, don't have a presentation. Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's really a privilege and an honor to speak about Africa. I've been living in Africa for over 20 years in my life, so I consider myself partly an African citizen, and it's definitely a continent that I really care about. And it was also amazing to work with WWF on this report, because it really shows a little bit also the contradiction of pathways for development. We heard in other fora that Africa has the greatest potential to increase food production because it's the country with the most available arable land. And in some of these circuits, in some of these discussions, that means the usual extractive approach, which has been degrading our environment, losing our biodiversity. And I would like to, maybe on the biodiversity side, highlight one thing, is that Africa is home to human beings and is home to the mammals to which we belong. And I think Africa has a particular responsibility about our own common origin. And so how do we take this arable land, and how do we take the output of this report? I think Africa has an amazing opportunity to actually be food secure by using agroecological approaches or regenerative approaches or nature-based approach, whatever you want to call them. And I'm saying that because first of all, there is a lot of knowledge around that. Now, when you talk to a Chinese policymaker and who wants to make their production system more green, they tell you, oh, that's easy. This is what our farmers have been doing. We add a little bit of science, we make it more viable, more profitable, and it's going to work. When you talk to an African policymaker, it says, well, this is what our farmers have been doing for thousands of years, and they're still poor and food insecure, so it doesn't work. But I think those African policymakers need to consider that those who are advocate for greater agroecological pathways are not advocating for keeping business as usual. They are advocating to integrate science into those traditional systems to make them more resilient, more productive, more nutritious. And we will hear later some numbers about this nutrition, but I would like to emphasize that Africa not only has 25% of stunted children, which is a dramatic statistic, but it's also showing a growing increase in obesity and cardiovascular diseases. And that's also something that needs to be taken into account, because that conventional intensification will lead to more obesity, calorie-dense product. And so, according to WHO, this increase in obesity is a kind of ticking bomb for Africa. And we have the solutions, and we've been, one of the good things of talking at the last day of COP is that you heard so much about regenerative nature-based, and I think there is a lot of new ideas emerging. I think the solutions are technically available, but they need support. And I think Africa has a number of entry points through which they can be better supported. One is, for example, take the agrobiodiversity. Africa is known for 40% of what they are called neglected and underutilized species. And they are the neglected and underutilized species just because science didn't investigate them, but they are still used by a vast community. They address the nutritional crisis, they address the resilient crisis, the adaptation crisis. They have species, agroforestry species that are very little known, that can increase the mitigation of climate change. And so it has a lot of in-house resources that are not really used. And the African Free Trade Area could offer an opportunity to really upscale and to bring those products within the trade across Africa continents. Take the fonio, take the teff, just to mention two iconic cereal crops. And you have, of course, many more in the legumes, in the oil, in the roots and tubers, etc. Now, these require partnership, because of course again, the objection would be, how do we feed people with crops that have so low productivity? Well, we need breeding. The CGIER, Nature Positive, other initiatives can be supportive of increasing the productivity of these crops, so that if you imagine a transition, you can start using them more and more in your production system, in diversified farms. Something that will not be perceived as a threat when they start approaching these protected areas, because they will be diverse, there will be trees, so they can actually act more also as green corridor as much as they are for food production. And for example, the approach of Man and Biosphere Reserve that really look into those different level of activities within and around protected areas. And there is a need to investment. Farmers need transition. A lot of the smallholder farmers have seen increased degraded land, and so they need to be restored. They need to be brought back to their full potential. And once again, we have the methodology and the tools to do that, but once again, we need resources, we need investment, we need the funds, because these require shifting from a more fertilizer-based approach, in which we all know that fertilizer is needed in Africa, but it can be used more wisely. Those increase can go alongside with developing technically sound, scientifically proven biofertilizer, enriched with nitrogen or other nutrients that are missing from the package, so that they can not only provide enough nitrogen that is needed for the farm growth, but also the carbon that is needed for restoring those soils. So in Nature Positive, we are trying to do all of that. We are trying to also imagine different ways of, and I close. We try to promote different ways of farming. For example, in Western Kenya, we are working on using what used to be very degraded pastoral land into aggregated agroecological farms, in which of over 100 acres, where the smallholder communities agreed to plant according to a zoning approach, in which these communities will have the trees along the river that can do beekeeping. So we are planning to have about 10 value chains from these areas of 100 acres, so it will be a kind of smallholder no more. The smallholder will be able to work on much larger areas. And this will enhance the biodiversity, will enhance the sequestration of greenhouse gases, will enhance the opportunity for the farmers to earn more income, because this is critical. Whatever transition you want to do, it has to be viable and it has to reduce poverty in rural areas. So, policy incentives to support the transition. Many countries are looking at agroecology strategies, finance to fund for the transition, linkage to processes and trade agreements that are important for these products to be reviewed, and of course link with the environment aspect, because that has to be within planetary boundary. And as I said, I strongly believe that Africa has a kind of responsibility, because it is the common home of all of us, to really conserve that environment where we are coming from. And I hope that with the evidence-based, the research, the science, the collaboration between the CGIAR and WWF, which by itself is a great innovation, because until a few years ago, WWF would see us as the fierce enemies of the environment, and now we're able to put together and to work together in a food system that are good for the people and good for the planet, that we can really make a breakthrough. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Carlo, and I think you really brought forward some of the key issues that are critical as we try to define Africa's ecological feature, looking at the food systems. I think you did mention one of the things that came up strong in your presentation was the whole issue about partnership. What kind of partnership do we need to get this right? But more importantly, what are the investments that are needed? What are the technology that are needed for us to start getting this? And I think this is important to bring us to the panel conversation here today. And we have an interesting panel that will help us to understand these intricacies, but the dynamics of Africa's food system, because like you said, Africa has the largest arable land, but is that arable land available only for food production? How do we manage the space? And I think Nancy's presentation also did talk about land use, but also land rights, which are crucial in securing food system. So our panel today, we have three interesting panelists, and they're all quite knowledgeable on their issues. And we try to make sure that we have a balanced partnership or a balanced panel so that we try to see how to navigate through this. And I would like to start by welcoming Dr. Lawali Garba. Dr. Lawali Garba is Division Manager of Agricultural Research, Production and Sustainability at the Agriculture and Agro-Industry Department at the African Development Bank. He is a civil engineer from Ecole Polytechnique Thiès in Senegal, and he also holds a PhD in environmental engineering from Ecole Polytechnique in Montreal, Canada. He has over 25 years of experience, and since joining the bank in 2011, he's been working on promoting sustainable and resilient transformation of agriculture, of African agriculture for food and nutrition security. He works on climate smart agriculture, technologies, and facilitating access to resilient infrastructure to farmers and pastoralists. Thanks, Dr. Garba. Our next panelist is Dr. Samuel Ogala. Dr. Samuel Ogala is the African Union Commission's Senior Climate Change Advisor. He has worked for over 2 decades in various roles, such as Commonwealth Climate Finance, Advisor to the Government of Eswatini. He's been Senior Specialist for Africa at Solidaridad Network, Head of Programs and Acting Executive Director at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, Kenya, and with the West African Network for Peace Building, WANEP, among others. He has also served as a lecturer at prestigious universities such as the Catholic University of Eastern Africa and the Abubakar Tafawa Balewa University in Nigeria, I guess. Thanks, Dr. Samuel. And our last panelist will be Dr. Claudia Riegler. So Claudia is from she is Director of Natural Resource and Resilience Unit of the International Food Policy Research Institute and co-lead of the CIGA initiative on Nexus Gains. She will have an opportunity to tell us more about this. She coordinates research at the intersection of nature, agriculture, and development for tangible progress towards more equitable and resilient food systems. Like I said earlier, she's a co-lead of the CIGA Nexus Gain initiative. She drives research on the role of energy in transforming food and water systems and on climate change and adaptation. Claudia received a PhD in agricultural economics from the Center of Development Research, University of Bonn, and an MA in international development economics from Yale University. So you all bear with me that we have a very interesting panel to help us unpack some of these issues that we discussed. And I will start with you, Dr. Lawali. You are from the African Development Bank, and as we hear, or as we read from your bio, you're a big champion for climate-smart agriculture. And my question to you will be, what is the vision of the bank when it comes to ecological sustainable agricultural development in Africa, and what can the bank do to drive this transition, as we heard from Nancy's presentation?
Okay, thanks for this question. I'm sorry, I'll go in French, so I don't know if you can have the kit for the translation. Or
the kids, you can get the kids.
If you are bilingual, it is okay.
Just 1 minute.
Okay.
So you all, those who, yeah. So while we're waiting for the kids to get ready, I think we'll go for the second, for Dr. Samuel.
Okay.
Dr. Samuel Ogala. My question to you, especially from the African Union perspective, and as you lead, African Union leads the Africa We Want by 2063, is the African Union Green Recovery Action Plan and its climate change and resilient development strategy and action plans call for climate resilient and sustainable agricultural development in Africa. To what extent does this vision drive the policies of African governments, and what the key policy levers that this consortium of partners who have heard here today should focus on to drive for sustainable and resilient food systems? And I should maybe add that in 2011, we saw the decision in Maputo, in Malabo, rather, the Malabo Declaration, that called for African leaders to put a certain percentage of their GDP on agriculture. How is that being shaped within the African Union, but also how do you lead this conversation with African governments?
Thank you so much, the program director, for having me, and also the organizers of the event. I think we've talked so much about the Africa Agenda 2063, which is the development framework for the continent. And also, I heard Carlos also talk about the great prospect on the African continent. It's known that 65% of the continent has uncultivated arable land globally. So that means if Africa hosts 65% of all global uncultivated arable land, it has a huge potential to feed itself and feed the world. So the world will be looking up to Africa on how we practice our agriculture, whether it's going to be sustainable or not sustainable, and the way we practice it will define the impact on our climate. Again, because it's the sector that contributes the second largest emission to the greenhouse gas emission, globally, after the transport or energy sector. So how we define our agricultural practices and the way we go about it tells a lot. So from the Africa Agenda 2063, we came out also, draft the African Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2022 to 2032. And some of the people that also worked on that here, I can see Laura in the house and the team. So this followed a very consultative process and very participatory process to come out with this roadmap, which is guiding all interventions on the continent as it relates to climate change. We also have the African Union Green Recovery Action Plan 2021 to 2027 that is also guiding the post-COVID recovery. And all this framework touch on agriculture. So for those who might not be familiar with our climate change and resilient development strategy, and how it actually helped us shape the agricultural practices on the continent. And let me just give us a snippet of what it takes and how it's helping policies in our member states across the regional economic communities that we have in shaping the transformation of the agriculture system. So we have 4 strategic harnesses in the African Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2022 to 2032. And all this promotes regenerative agriculture, climate resilient agriculture on the continent. So on the strategic harness number 2, which focus more on agriculture, it says that we need to adopt a pathway towards a transformative climate resilient development. That is where we saw the agricultural interventions across the continent and the member states sit. But under that strategic analysis of 2, which talk about the transformative pathway to development, climate resilient development on the continent, it focuses on 10 actions, practical actions, interventions that can be done to help us in transitioning of the agricultural practices on the continent and making it more sustainable, more resilient. And I had issues of intensification versus extensification. So this is a framework that encourages intensification of how do we practice the agricultural issues sustainably in balance with nature. And that will have also less negative impact on the environment. So one of the aspects that does touch on the ecological agricultural practices is the action number 1, which says we have to promote the equitable sharing of climate risk and reward among all food system and actors on the continent. These particular actions also itemize a series of activities in the strategy that talks about how do we need to embark on this as a continent to achieve that we have this. The action number 2 talks about enhancing resilience of food system against climate effect. And that is where we have to work with the regional economic communities, work also with our member states on the use of smart, innovative, and climate resilience technologies to enhance nutrition and other agricultural practices that are beneficial to us. The action number 3 of the strategy, which is pegged on axis number 2, talks about enhancing agroecological transition. And I want to zero in on this, since we're talking about agroecology and also ecological transition. So the action points to enhancing these particular practices to reduce greenhouse gas intensity. And what are some of the things that we're supporting our member states to do in this transition is providing resources and enabling environment to facilitate transition to a more nature-positive production system by farmers. Nancy talks about the practice of the agricultural system that is majorly by our smallholder farmers on the continent. And so if we have to zero in our interventions and supporting our 55 member states in this aspect, we have to look at this particular aspect very critically. Also the aspect of research, supporting research, extension and implementation towards agroecological, regenerative, and nature-based and indigenous approaches. That we must not forget, that there is a lot of indigenous practices that help us, our forefathers and our current smallholder farmers have been practicing. And we need to scale up that. We are not going to throw away what we've been doing. And I heard Carlos also talk about that. These practices need to be enhanced. We know that if we must feed Africa and feed the world, it's not going to be the usual cutlass and hoe approaches. And so if we need to upscale, research needs to be done. We are supporting our member states, both technical and financial support, through this strategy and policy enhancement to see that we transition ecologically sound agricultural practices to help the member state with research. It's not going to be planning without research. We're going to plan with statistics and what is obtainable, what is usable, and what will help our smallholder farmers in this transition. I'm also conscious of time, so I wouldn't go into detail. But we also talk about interventions like strengthening food system governance and interventions across the African region, as well as strengthening finances, investment. We can't do this transition without investment. So investment is key, and resource allocation and interventions are also key to how we do this. developing bankable measures for ecosystem protection and restoration. Carlos talked about the biodiversity, which Africa continent is known for, very rich in that. So if we must talk about agroecology system, we must also take cognizance of the biodiversity, the rich biodiversity, and not losing more of our biodiversity to agricultural practices, ensuring a focus on food security, land use, we talk about land tenure system, lands rights and protections. These are all enshrined in the African Climate Change Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2023 to 2033. Also, the aspect of restoring and sustainably managing agricultural system, including livestock system, is also there. Protecting key carbon sinks in all ecosystems found in Africa and building technical capacity in implementing regenerative agricultural practices are all enshrined. So the climate change strategy of the African Union and the Green Recovery Action Plan actually took into cognizance the issue of agroecology and how we need to do it. It specifies the steps we need to take, the actions we need to follow, and the activities we need to carry in order for Africa to become climate resilient in all our agricultural practices through regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture, and also climate resilient agriculture. These are all enshrined in the African Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan 2022 to 2032, 32 under the strategic annex number 2. I thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Samuel Ogala. And I think you raised a couple of issues there that is a good way that might be, by some design, Dr. Gaba couldn't speak first. Because I think his intervention should help to respond to some of the issues raised, like on investment, but also how do we position, how do we ensure this transition? And that, I believe, is the role of the African Development Bank. And so I'll come back to you, Dr. Lawale, on what is the vision of the African Development Bank when it comes to ecological, sustainable agricultural development in Africa, and what can the bank do to drive the transition? Remembering very well that the bank's 10-year strategy has 2 objectives, the inclusive growth and green growth. How do we bring this to bear on this transition, on these ecological features? Thank you.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Je dois en tout cas d'entrée de jeu signaler que la transformation de l'agriculture africaine est une des grandes priorités de la Banque africaine de développement depuis 2016. Et notre vision, c'est que l'agriculture africaine doit être transformée pour devenir un secteur agro-industriel compétitif,
agri-food competitive and inclusive sector that can generate wealth, improve life conditions and protect environment. This transformation has to target some objectives. We have to increase the productivity of African agriculture and then reduce the important trade deficit that in Africa we have, because we have more than $100 billion of export every year. Then agriculture is really important in economy in Africa. We have like 70% of our workers that work in agriculture. So it's indicated that we need to develop value chain from agriculture to struggle against poverty. Then we have an agriculture that is one of the most vulnerable toward climate change, because 20% of our producers are very small. So it's a need to adapt African agriculture to reinforce resilience of those little producers. And last aspect, we need this transformation to be sustainable so that it can protect the environment, the natural capital for today and for the future generation. So it is an important element of our vision. It's crucial for nous that this transformation is sustainable, because the advantage that we have in the African context is that today we have an agriculture that is largely dependent of the natural capital, but is using the least chemical fertilizer. So we have the opportunity to do things differently so we can learn from the lessons taken. So the idea is not to use too much fertilizer, but to have sustainable agriculture for the preservation of the environment. And for the economic side, it's important for the preservation of our economic productivity. And also we have to adopt at a large scale technologies and climate smart methodologies. So in order to reduce effect of the agriculture on the climate, but also on the environment, so that to materialize this aspect, our strategy made the sustainability a catalyst of agriculture that we call the plan AXA, that emphasize on an important element, promote the integrated use of water, promote the durable management of lands, with promoting adoption of cultural practices that are adequate, and also enhance the access to technological methodologies that are resilient to climate change. So it's really important that we ensure that all investments that are secured regarding climate change, but are also sustainable, reducing their impact on the environment. So it's supposed that we bring a lot of solutions to the small producers. So this program of sustainability deployed its activities mainly in the region most vulnerable, so Sahel, Congo Basin, but also in Southern Africa. And since 2018, we invested more than $1 billion to help the small producers. But this agriculture, we have to make sure that all the projects deployed respect the environmental rules of the countries and also of the bank. So systematically, we have 4 measures that are taken for sustainability. Every project has to have an assessment for environmental and social rules. So we want to promote the rational use of resources to control the pollution, and also to manage the use of land, so that producers make the adequate investment, and also promote an agriculture that can ensure the preservation of wildlife and sustainable biodiversity. So depending on the region, the context is different. If you take Congo Basin, countries are planning agriculture development. So we need solutions that are different from a region to another. But what is important is that this program, with the agriculture development of the country, has to be sustainable, with the access to climate smart tools that are sustainable everywhere in Africa. Interpreting stuff.
The African Development Bank is positioned within this landscape to help change Africa's agriculture more. And like you mentioned, your strategy, one of the key areas of your strategy is the use of sustainability as a driver of that change. And I'm glad that the bank is really doing enough. You said you invested like $1 billion already within the regions, and I think that could help start changing Africa's agricultural landscape. But then, I will now come to you, Dr. Claudia, and you've heard the two gentlemen. They've talked about the policy environment, the investment needed. And I think now we're coming to you as a partner, CGI. And CGI is quite present in Africa, across all the African countries, I think, with a big office in Yaoundé and Kenya, where you, from C4, and a craft and all that. I think you've been doing an amazing job in Africa. No, AFPRI. Sorry, I'm missing things.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. So the Institute for Food Policy Research Institute. So my question to you will be, as a key thought leader when it comes to policies for sustainable food systems, what key changes does your organization see as needed in order to drive for more resilient and ecological sustainable food systems in Africa? How do we get there? You've heard what the two gentlemen have said. The Malabo Declaration, are we there yet of the 0.7 of the GDP? Are we there yet? Africa Development Bank's two key strategies of inclusive growth and green growth, but also Feed Africa, are we there yet?
No, we are not there yet, and it's extremely unlikely that we are getting there anytime soon. So I'll start with a couple numbers, and I really then want to talk about Malabo, because I think it's an important, really an important area. So why are we not there yet? So I looked at just some numbers of agriculture growth and population growth over the last 20 years. Cereal yield growth over the last 20 years has been 1.5% per year. Total production growth, of course, has been larger, but most of the production growth has been still contributed from land expansion. And that's obviously goes 100% against our focus of preserving, cherishing natural capital. So we are obviously not going in the right direction. Cereals, things are going better than other crops. And that's in part because CJR and partners continue to invest a little bit in agricultural research for cereals. If we look at other crops, roots and tuber crops, yield growth 0.1% per year over 20 years. That's nothing. It's nothing. Only 4% of production growth contributed from yields. The rest has all been area expansion. We are obviously not going in the right direction. Vegetable yield growth over the last 20 years has been negative. That doesn't mean that our vegetables are shrinking, but it means that there has been a shift from larger vegetables, maybe something like pumpkins, to something smaller like peas. But we are obviously not doing well at all. Negative yield growth across all vegetable crops in Africa. And then we compare this with population growth of 1.9% per year over the same 20 years. What we are getting is increased net food import dependency of the continent. Continues to grow by a business as usual scenario by 2050. 54% of all foods that Africans will consume will have to be imported. So under business as usual, things will get a lot worse. They have been getting a lot worse. We see very rapid increase in hunger, food insecurity, malnutrition in all directions, including stunting, obesity. That is basically a parallel trend. I do not see any difference. I don't see any change happening. So we really need to put all hands on deck. And all hands on deck means obviously agricultural approaches, industrialization approaches. But first and foremost, we do need investment in agricultural research in Africa. There's no country in the world that I have ever encountered that has been able to get agricultural growth going without investing in agricultural research. We see only one experiment in the world, and that is Africa, that is trying to develop agricultural growth without investing in agricultural research. And I just wanted to put those numbers because you specifically asked for the Malabo Declaration and the cut-up goals. As you said, there's an agreement by all African states that 1% of GDP generated in agriculture, where sometimes 50% of the population is engaged in, just 1% of the GDP you generate should be invested in agricultural research. But in fact, there's 44%, so almost half of all investment in agricultural research on the continent is done by only 3 countries, okay? And those are Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria. The rest is pretty much investing nothing. And then there has been also a decline in the share of agriculture GDP that African governments are investing in research. And the decline has been from 0.54%, which is far from the 1% agreement, to just 0.39% of ag GDP are countries investing on average. 37 of 44 countries with data obviously are under the 1%. 24% of these countries spend much less than 0.5%. So I'm not saying, that Africa is not to blame for that. There's a whole system that's to blame for that. But if we're anyway serious about making Africa the food basket for the world, the potential is there, we actually have to invest. And right now we are not doing that. The trends are going in the wrong direction. Hunger is growing as a result, and we'll see also a lot more migration. I wish it wouldn't be the case, but that's what the numbers tell us. Yeah.
For this. And unfortunately, we will not have time because the next session is to begin. Immediately we wrap up. But thanks, ending on that positive note of it's not about Africa, it's the system. And I think one of the things we want to get as we wrap up the COP28 today in Dubai is what kind of agreement will come out from here that will help shape the way we redesign agriculture, we reposition Africa as a breadbasket of the world, but taking into cognizance the fact that we have this rich natural capital like Dr. Lawali mentioned, and I think Dr. Samuel as well, to try to balance the inequalities of the world, right? And I think we have this opportunity to move things ahead from here, to work together to define a new pathway for Africa that depends on its biodiversity, on its ecosystem, but also help to put things back on track. So I want to thank you all for making time to be here. I know it's early morning, but it's also the end of COP. So, and then we'll have a very interesting event coming immediately after, which is by the youth, the African youth as well. So you can stay behind and enjoy. So thanks again, and it was a pleasure.